After spending the weekend with the Monsters and Memories playtest, which I really enjoyed, I did have some feedback that I wanted to make a little video about. But before I get into that, I did just want to preface all this by saying that this is still a very early version of the game. Early access is still a good 6 months or so away, so there's a lot that's going to change between now and then. You can see the developer's roadmap online. They post what they're working on. They have dev streams all the time. You can follow along with how it's improving and how it's changing. Similarly, as you can see in the background here, I'm going through the character creation process. There's all kinds of stuff in here, classes and races and deities that I'd love to go over, but I'm keeping this video a little more technical and a little bit more overview of just where the game is at right now. In future videos, I'll definitely focus on classes and races and abilities and zones and all that stuff. But for now, since this is really the first time I've had to play it, I just kind of wanted to flag some stuff that is an indication of where the game is at right now, and just kind of get an overall feel for what I think it's going to be like in the future. As I mentioned in a previous video, I've been pretty excited about this game. It's a spiritual successor to EverQuest. I loved EverQuest, so I really was excited for this. And having played it now, I can say that I'm definitely still into it. I was a little bit concerned at first. It seemed very slow early on. I guess I've gotten too used to World of Warcraft and whatnot, but once I got to level 5, 6, it started to pick up. The gameplay started to feel familiar. It started to feel more like EverQuest. And yeah, I was enjoying it. I ended up getting into a little group on my second day of playing, and we cleared tons of stuff, and we got tons of experience, and we had good chats. It was just like EverQuest, as I remember. There's definitely something to be said for this type of game where, even though the fundamental gameplay looks simplistic compared to something like World of Warcraft on paper, when you really get in there and you're essentially forced to group with people and you're sort of essentially forced to interact with other people, it definitely starts to create the kind of environment that I feel is the real foundation of MMOs, more so than just skills and abilities and levels and those sorts of things. The community is really what makes these kind of games special. And having played it for a couple of days, I would say that I'm still excited about it. And, I understand the graphics and all of that stuff are not going to be on par with what you're going to get from New World and World of Warcraft and whatever else. But I would say my only real complaints at this point, with the understanding that things are still happening and this is a very early version and whatnot, there's some pretty, I think, easy wins. I don't want to be too much like EverQuest in the sense that I don't think it needs to be exactly like it. I think that we can learn from all of the things that have occurred in the industry in general since then and apply some of those things. So, I'll definitely be posting more videos, but the glaring things to me that need to be fixed, I would say, and when I say fixed, I mean more things that need a little polish before a real live release. There's definitely still tons of stuff that they have in the pipeline, so I'm not really talking about things that aren't implemented yet, that they're already planning on, but features or issues that are technical and probably will be looked at and are things that will probably continue to improve over the lifetime of the game, but just stuff that I feel isn't quite ready yet for a real release. And this isn't a critique or a complaint of them or anything. It's expected this early on, but definitely wanted to at least flag these things because it is something that I feel like for players who aren't so tolerant of issues like this, if it's not resolved before a real release, I think some of these things will hinder its adoptability. The general fluidity of the placement of mobs. There was just far too many mobs trying to walk up trees and walk up cliffs. The movement of other players and the sort of, interactions at a close range with other players. It felt unfinished. And like I said, it is unfinished. So some of that, can be passed. I just hope that this isn't something that is sort of just going to be the way it is. That was one of always my things about a lot of MMOs. World of Warcraft just feels so fluid when you're moving around, you're jumping, you're doing all this stuff. You rarely see players warping around and things like that. Unfortunately, there was a lot of that. And in some cases, it was, more than I would say is even kind of reasonable at this stage. I think that if they could improve the client-side predictions and smooth out the motion, especially for distant objects and things like that, which, again, is probably something they're looking into, because the rest of the game technically can't really compete with, AAA big-budget MMOs. I think if they really nail the movement and make the game feel very fluid, I think it'll go a long way to making it feel really polished, even if the graphics and whatnot aren't quite at that level. Like, there were some obvious situations where some relatively simple fixes would have removed a lot of it. So I hope that is something that they're working on. I assume that it probably is. I would say that was one of my main concerns. At one point in the beginning, I forgot how EverQuest kind of worked, and I was wandering around and got killed by a wolf, and then I could not find my body for the life of me. I felt like I had a pretty good idea, but I wasn't sure, so I ended up wandering around, this time being much more careful. I knew my body was out there somewhere, but I just couldn't remember where. So, while it felt like a waste of time, eventually I got back to where my body was. And the thing that was interesting to me was that in most other games, I would have been able to open up a map, seen my corpse on the map, or had a, pointer on the mini-map to where my corpse is, that sort of thing. But as a result of this awkward experience, I learned a little bit about the actual geography of the zone that I was in. It became something that I learned, not just something that I saw, right? And that was one of the things I loved about EverQuest, was that the better players were players who were knowledgeable about the areas, much like in real life, as opposed to just players that were able to read the UI more quickly. And I eventually sort of started to figure out where I was, went back and got my corpse, looted my corpse, and then was immediately killed by the same wolf. And, if that's not the EverQuest experience, I don't know what to tell you. But I was frustrated, but you know what? I kind of made a plan and decided that I was going to go back and kill that wolf one day. So I went back, this time being careful to drag my corpse a little bit away from the area so that I could loot it safely and get out of there, which I did, and I moved on with my life. It wasn't until a whole 5 or so levels later that I went back and realized that wolf was actually kind of no joke. Even at level 5-6, it was not super easy. But I can safely say that by the end of the playtest, I was able to conquer that wolf and repay him for what he did to me early on. But I didn't get anything. I didn't get any loot. I didn't really accomplish anything from that experience. However, it was kind of fun, and that was sort of what I loved about these games in the first place, was that simply playing the game is fun, which I think is the goal of many games. It's not about what you get. It's not about, what you can show off to other people, or that you can show how you're better than anyone. Like, even the bad experiences that I had during the playtest were kind of enjoyable. So I think that was something that made me really believe that it does have potential. There was something about EverQuest that was fun. Another thing that I think that needs sort of a little bit more modern refinement is targeting. It's pretty hard to tell what you have targeted There's instances where you tab target to something, especially at nighttime, when you can't see anything. You can tab target to it, so you're just blindly hoping that you figure out what direction it's in. And it's just like, if you can't see something, maybe it's best if you can't tab target to it at all. Or if you can tab target to it, you need some sort of indicator. And then even in daytime, when you have several mobs, I don't think that simply highlighting the name tag of the mob is reasonable. I don't think we need to go as far as having like full-blown nameplates like World of Warcraft or anything, but a simple outline on the mob, even subtle, or a ground projected texture, something like that. I do think that we need to deviate a little bit from what EverQuest had. Even EverQuest in the later days had UI add-ons that would have projected textures for what you're targeting and stuff, and most players use those. So I think that we need to bring those sorts of things a little bit more into the modern era. I can forgive a lot because, like I said, this is a very small team. It's an ambitious project, but yeah, there's definitely some things they can fix. I'm sure I'll have more comments. I'm sure I'll have more to say. At this point, I only made it up barely to level 8, thanks a lot to a group that I had towards the end there that helped me get all the way from level 6 to level almost 8, pretty much in the time that it took me to get from level 5 to 6. It was a good time. We did some exploring. There were some issues there in terms of just the general feel of things, but maybe I'll talk about that on another video. I just wanted to give my initial impressions, which overall I would say were really good. At the beginning, I was a little bit not sure. I was like, it's too much like EverQuest. I already did this. It's a little outdated. But once you kind of get past the initial growing pains and you start to just like appreciate it for what it is and get into some groups and play the game the way it was kind of meant to play, I found myself having more fun with this game than I've had playing super polished World of Warcraft in several years. So definitely optimistic still. But yeah, looking forward to the next playtest, or whenever I get a chance to play it. I'll have more to think about and more to talk about later. Something else that I wanted to mention, I guess, was just the environments. A lot of MMOs do this where they try to leave empty space for the future, kind of. So, like, you'll have these towns with buildings with nobody in them, or you'll have, NPCs that are just there for no real reason, and the idea is that they're going to be useful in the future, but then they never end up getting filled in. And that is something that is much more, I guess, apparent right now, but I did hear in the comments on my last video that this is something the developers are aware of. They do kind of have a plan. Some of these areas are for uninstanced player housing, and others might be sort of rentals that players can take on to be merchants or other sort of features. I'm not 100% sure on exactly how that'll play out, but it does seem like this was intentional. So for now, in these early playtests, we'll just have to live with it and see how it continues to develop. One of the problems with even super polished modern MMOs is that once they establish an area with NPCs and quest givers and whatnot, it never changes. So for decades, it remains the same. If they can really follow through on their goal of allowing some of these areas to be more player organized, it'll definitely make the world feel more alive and more interesting, and it'll change over time to give you a reason to revisit areas that you've already been. Having it change over time is actually great. That's something that's missing from even like AAA MMOs, is simply changing the world over time rather than just having an NPC say the same thing to you every single time. You could have it develop and be based on faction. Like there's so many opportunities to make a single basic boring area change over time and be dictated by what a player chooses instead of just by what the developers choose. I do have to say that as much as I appreciate the older styled graphics, it's fairly nostalgic, and I think that it fits fine, and it will hopefully allow them to iterate more quickly on things like different armor and whatnot, because just the quality is not so complex. It should be easier to add new things here and there. However, the buildings and the structures really feel a little bit too dated. I think that they need to be brought up a little bit. You know, we're kind of past the point in games that we should have beds and chairs and stuff that look like they're just made out of the level geometry instead of being actual objects. I think that definitely there needs to be someone looking at that, because I think when you're wandering around town, it just feels old. When you're out in the forest and you're killing monsters, it's not bad. You know, it's obviously dated, but that's by design. But when you're in the town, it almost feels rushed, for lack of a better word. It just feels like they just threw in some basic buildings without much thought as to how they are structured or whether or not they're even slightly realistic looking, and just kind of left it at that. The interface in general is probably something that needs to have another round of polish. It's got a solid foundation and all of the things you need are in there, but there's just a little bit of awkwardness in terms of how items stack when you're looting, in terms of customization options. There just really needs to be a little bit more to it. I don't think or want them to go to the length of having add-ons or anything like that, but I do think that there needs to be another round of polish over the interface in general. Just, you know, round out some of the rough edges and make it a little bit more usable. More than once, I heard people in the global chat channels in the game talking about the nighttime and how dark it was, saying that that's something that needs to be fixed. Personally, I liked the darkness. I think that it made nighttime feel kind of scary. You know, you definitely sort of started to plan your playtime around the day and the night cycles. And once you start getting used to making campfires and using torches and that sort of thing, it really wasn't that bad. I do think, like I said earlier, that some of the targeting needs to be changed so that when you really can't see something, I don't think it should be so easy to tab target to it or select it in general. But overall, I don't think that the darkness is that bad. There's talk about people, you know, maxing out their gamma to deal with the nighttime, and if people want to do that, so be it. That's been something that people have been doing in dark games for a long time. I think that by changing the targeting so that you were limited by the game rather than just being able to max out your gamma and ignore the whole nighttime phase, essentially, I think that that would level out the playing field a little bit and make it more as it was intended, even for people who were trying to, you know, circumvent the darkness by maxing out gamma. One of the things I really loved is that although the graphics were a little older by design, some of the lighting effects were brought up to modern standards, and it would be really a great effect if they could include more modern elements in mix with the older style of retro graphics. I think that it works well, and I think that it would be welcomed by most players. With all that said, I should mention that I really did enjoy my time playing it. As I've gone through in this video, I think there's things that need to be addressed, and it is still early, so there's definitely time to do that, and I'm sure that a lot of those things are already on their radar. But overall, you know, I had a fun time playing. I've played more than I should have. I had a good time on both of the days that I played the playtest, and I was sad when it was over. I'm excited to play again. I'd definitely like to maybe check out some other classes, but even this early on, one of the things that I really liked was that I was already getting attached to this character, and I had already sort of gone through so many struggles to get where I had gone to, that just making another alt just for fun didn't seem that appealing. And that is definitely something that I think is missing from a lot of modern MMOs. That characters almost feel disposable. You can just make a new one and level them up in a couple days and it's no big deal. Whereas I already feel like I have some history with this character, and I already kind of feel like I've gone through experiences, and I'm only, level 8-ish. So I think that they've done a good job of adding in what made EverQuest great, and I think that if they continue to polish some of the things that need a little more polish, continue to add content to some of the things that are a little sparse, it's definitely going to be enjoyable, and it's definitely going to achieve their goal of making something that is similar to early MMOs, but still enjoyable for a younger generation to play. So I'm looking forward to the next playtest. I'll definitely post some more videos as I think of more things to say, and we'll see you in the next one.